Chapter 1. The Wrong Mask. The problem with vampire masquerades, Nell Kavanaugh had decided, was that everyone else's mask looked like it had been forged by goblins in a forgotten age, and hers looked like it came in a 2-pack with a plastic scythe. She adjusted the cheap raven mask on her nose. The elastic was already cutting into her ears. She'd bought it from a place called Spooky's Party Barn for $4.75, and it showed. "This is research," she muttered to herself, scanning the vast cathedral hall. "This is for the dissertation." Her doctoral advisor, a woman with a worrying enthusiasm for fringe historical societies, had pressed the invitation into her hand that morning. A genuine recreation of a 13th century Wallachian court ceremony. Eleanor. The authenticity is unparalleled. The authenticity was, in fact, so unparalleled that Nell was fairly certain these weren't history buffs in very good contact lenses. She was standing near a pillar, nursing a glass of what she desperately hoped was cranberry juice, when the hall went silent. Not quiet. The kind of silence that happened when a room full of people stopped breathing at the same time. Or when a room full of not people had never been breathing in the first place. On a throne of polished stone sat a man who radiated authority the way a furnace radiated heat. Without trying, he was all sharp angles and unnerving stillness, dark-haired, pale-skinned, dressed in black silk that moved like water. His gaze swept the crowd with the expression of someone reviewing a spreadsheet they'd already memorized. He rose, the crowd parted. He was walking directly toward her. No, not toward her, toward the raven mask. She could see it in his eyes. A focused, ceremonial precision. He wasn't seeing her face, he was seeing the mask. Before she could move, before she could say, "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake," his hand was at the back of her neck. His fingers were ice. His other hand tilted her chin, and for one disorienting second, she was looking directly into eyes that were darker than any eyes had a right to be, and then there was a sharp stinging pinch at her throat, a dizzying sense of something being drawn out of her, and the entire hall was watching. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5. It was the longest 4 seconds of her life. He drew back. A single drop of red, her red at his lip. His eyes were closed, his expression one of ancient ceremonial satisfaction. Then he opened his eyes and saw her face. The transformation was magnificent. The satisfaction evaporated. His jaw went slack. His eyes, which had shifted to something amber and unsettling, widened with the dawning catastrophic realization of a man who had just confidently walked into the wrong bathroom. He looked at the mask, at her face, at the mask again. His mouth formed a silent shape that was unmistakably, "Oh no." Nell stared at him. Her neck was throbbing. Her heart was trying to leave through her ribs. "You," she said, her voice impressively level for a woman who had just been bitten by a stranger in formal wear, "have made a mistake?" He didn't answer. He was looking over her shoulder, presumably at wherever the correct raven-masked woman was standing. The color, what little of it existed, had drained from his face entirely. Nell removed the $4.75 raven mask, dropped it on the stone floor, and walked out of the cathedral. She didn't run, she walked. Quickly. Through the enormous oak doors, down the stone steps, and into the cold night air, where she flagged down the first taxi she could find and said, "Just drive." The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Rough night at the goth club? Something like that. 3 days later, at 9:17 p.m., there was a knock on her apartment door. Not a knock, really. More of a presence. A heavy, expectant silence on the other side of the wood. She looked through the peephole. She closed her eyes. She opened them. He was still there. The Vampire King. Standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway of her decidedly non-regal apartment building, wearing a black coat that probably cost more than her tuition, looking like someone had forced him to attend his own sentencing. She did not open the door. "I know you are in there," he said, his voice a low resonance that vibrated through the wood. Nell said nothing. I can hear your heartbeat, he continued. He said it the way someone might confess to a parking violation, reluctantly, and with the clear sense that he was the one being inconvenienced. She pressed the intercom button. That's incredibly creepy, and I need you to know that. It is not creepy. It is biology. It is creepy biology. A pause. She could almost hear him recalibrating. My name is Gideon Sterling, he said. I am. I was the one who at the ceremony who bit me at a party. In front of 300 people. Yes, without asking. The ceremony has a specific. Without asking. The silence that followed was heavy enough to furnish. You are correct, he said. I did not ask. The ceremony required a specific participant, and I believed you to be that participant, and I was. Wrong. Yes, I was wrong. She opened the door 3 inches, leaving the security chain on. He stood there under the fluorescent hallway light, looking deeply miserable and completely out of place. His dark eyes met hers, and she watched him flinch. What do you want? She asked. I have been attempting to determine that for 3 days, he said. The honest answer is, I do not know. Since the ceremony, there is a pull, a directional compulsion. It is pointed at you. It will not stop. Toward your specific location. At all times. Nell stared at him. So you're basically a homing pigeon. Gideon Sterling, who had clearly been expecting many responses, but not that one, blinked. A very overdressed, very confused homing pigeon, she added. I am the king of the Northern Court, he said, his voice dropping half an octave into something that was probably supposed to be intimidating. Warden of the Carpathian Holdings. I have presided over the turning of empires. And right now, you're standing in a hallway that smells like someone microwaved fish because you can't stop following a grad student you accidentally bit. Homing pigeon. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise or the ghost of something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been immediately strangled by 800 years of dignity. I came to apologize, he said, formally. For what happened, it was a violation, I understand that. Nell studied him through the 3-inch gap. His jaw was tight, his hands were at his sides, perfectly still, no fidgeting, no shifting. He wasn't breathing, she realized. He'd stopped. You're not breathing, she said. I don't need to. That's the second creepiest thing you've said tonight. What was the first? The heartbeat thing. He nodded, as if making a mental note. I'll accept that you're sorry. I won't accept that showing up at my apartment unannounced makes it better. How did you even find me? The pull, he said. I did not seek your address. I did not investigate. I simply arrived. You arrived. The compulsion is directional. I walked until it stopped. It stopped here. At my door. At your door. At 9:17 p.m. for the 3rd consecutive night. Nell processed this. Then, you've been here every night. I have been standing in this hallway for approximately 40 minutes each evening. Then the compulsion eases enough for me to leave. It is, he added, with the restrained fury of a man confessing to a weakness profoundly inconvenient. For you. For us both, I imagine. Oh, I'm sleeping fine. Are you the one lying awake with a sore neck and questions about tetanus? He winced. It was small, but real. No, he said quietly. I am the one who performed the rite of resonance on the wrong person because her mask matched, and who has spent 72 hours being unable to think about anything else. I am also the one whose intended recipient is currently composing an epic poem about my ineptitude. She is on Canto 4. It is by all accounts devastating. Despite everything, Nell felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She killed it before it became a smile. How does it work? She asked. The pole. What does it feel like? He looked at her through the chain gap. His expression was careful, stripped of the theatrical register. Like a compass needle, constant quiet. When I am far from you, it is an itch. When I am here, it settles. Settles. The itch becomes a hum, low, almost tolerable. He paused. I have not slept in 8 centuries. I do not require sleep. But standing in this hallway is the closest I have felt to rest in a very long time. Something in her chest moved. She refused to identify it. You can't come in, she said. You know that. I know, the threshold thing, the invitation. I know how it works. I've read the books, yes, a flicker of something. The books are partially correct. Which parts? The threshold is real. I cannot cross without an invitation. The mechanism is, we are not sure. It has been this way for as long as anyone remembers. So you're physically unable to enter my apartment. Correct. Even if you wanted to. Even if I wanted to. Which I? He stopped, recalibrated. Which is irrelevant, because you have not invited me, and I am not asking you to. Good. Good. They stood there. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a television was playing a game show. The juxtaposition of an 800-year-old vampire king in bespoke black and the distant sound of someone spinning a wheel was so absurd that Nell almost laughed again. Good night, she said, and closed the door. Chapter 2. The Journal. I see, said Phineas. And at what point during the ceremony did you realize you had selected the wrong individual? Gideon, who was pacing the length of his study at a velocity that suggested internal combustion, stopped. During? I see. Phineas made a note on his tablet, an actual tablet with a stylus, not the technological kind. He was 500 years old and had the manner of a coroner performing an autopsy on someone he'd warned about their diet. And the intended recipient, Lady Octavia, was wearing what at the time a raven mask. Identical to the one worn by the graduate student, yes, whose mask was purchased from. He consulted his notes. A retail establishment called Spooky's Party Barn. Located on Route 9, currently rated 2 stars on the internet. You investigated the shop. I investigated the shop. I also investigated the graduate student. Her name is Nell Kavanagh. She is 27 years old. She is completing a doctoral thesis on 14th century Wallachian agriculture. She has no connection to the court, no knowledge of vampires, and no apparent interest in the supernatural. She was at the ceremony because her academic advisor is, and I am quoting the investigator's report, enthusiastic about fringe history. 14th century Wallachian agriculture, Gideon repeated. Crop rotation, specifically. I was there. I am aware, sire. You complained about the wheat, Gideon resumed pacing. The right. What does the archive say? Phineas set down his stylus. The right of resonance creates a unidirectional compulsion in the initiating vampire toward the source. The compulsion is physiological proximity seeking, attention fixing, sensory anchoring. It is not a blood bond. It does not require reciprocity. It is, in the oldest texts, described as, he paused delicately, a targeting mechanism. The rite was designed, historically, to lock a vampire's senses onto a specific individual. The ceremonial context is more recent. The original function was. I know what the original function was. His silence had the quality of a filed report. How do I end it? Gideon asked. The text suggests the compulsion fades over time, decades perhaps, a century or 2. The scholarship is imprecise. A century of standing in a hallway that smells of reheated fish. The alternative is to remain in proximity, which reportedly reduces the intensity. The text described this as satisfying the directional imperative. She called me a homing pigeon. Phineas, an ornithological comparison, not entirely without merit. She closed the door in my face. A prudent response, given the circumstances. Gideon stopped pacing. He stood at the window of his study, a room that contained furniture from 6 different centuries and a globe that still showed the Ottoman Empire, and looked out at the night. What of Lady Octavia? Lady Octavia's epic poem has reached Canto 6. The working title is The Ballad of the Blundering King. Her rhyme scheme is impeccable. I have been asked to comment on the meter. Did you? I suggested she tighten the caesura in the 3rd stanza. It was dragging the next day. Nell was in her natural habitat, the rare manuscript section of the university library. She was cross-referencing a land grant document from 1387 when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up. You have got to be kidding me. Gideon Sterling stood at the end of her table, dressed in a black coat that made him look like a visiting dignitary from a country that hadn't existed since the Reformation. He was holding a leather-bound book. The library is a public building, he said. The sign at the entrance reads, Open to all. That's not an invitation. That's a general policy statement. The threshold interpretation is ambiguous. I chose the generous reading. She put her pen down. What are you doing here? Diplomacy, he said. The word sat in his mouth like something he'd been prescribed. My advisor suggested I attempt a less confrontational approach. Your advisor suggested you stalk me at my workplace. He suggested I make a gesture of good faith. He placed the leather-bound book on her table. This is my personal journal from 1402 to 1411. It contains, among other things, a first-hand account of the agrarian reforms under Mircea the Elder. Nell stared at the book, then at him. You're bribing me with primary source material. I am offering a gesture of good faith that happens to align with your research interests. She opened the book. The pages were vellum, the ink faded to brown. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and filled with observations, so specific they could only have been written by someone who was there. This is real, she said quietly. I was there. Mircea was competent but humorless. His approach to crop rotation was surprisingly progressive for the era. His approach to dinner conversation was not. She looked up. His expression was careful. Not the theatrical horror of the masquerade or the stiff formality of the hallway. Something more tentative, as if he were holding something out and wasn't sure whether it would be taken or thrown back. If I accept this, she said, it doesn't mean I accept you. Understood. And if I find out you've been standing in the library parking lot at night, the compulsion brings me to your general vicinity. I have been. He paused. In the vicinity. How close is the vicinity? The coffee shop across the street. I have been drinking coffee. You can drink coffee? I cannot digest it, but I can hold the cup. It provides social camouflage. Nell looked at him. An 800-year-old vampire king, sitting in coffee shops he couldn't eat in, holding beverages he couldn't taste, because the pull in his blood wouldn't let him be anywhere else. It was also, in a way she didn't want to examine, a little bit sad. Mircea's approach to crop rotation, she said, pulling the journal closer. Tell me about it. He favored a 3-field system with a winter fallow period. I argued for a 4-field rotation. He called me a foreigner with no understanding of Wallachian soil. I was, technically, a foreigner, but the soil was not the issue. What was the issue? He was stubborn. A quality I have since observed in many competent people. She narrowed her eyes. Was that directed at me? It was directed at Mircea the Elder, who has been dead for 600 years and cannot defend himself. Your handwriting changes between 1404 and 1406, she said, turning a page. It gets tighter, more compressed. Something happened. He looked at her, most people didn't read handwriting. Most people didn't notice the space between letters contracting over 2 years of entries like a fist slowly closing. A famine, he said. Not mine, theirs, the regions. I could not eat their food, but I watched them not have it. You stayed through a famine? I was involved. In the administration, one does not leave during a crisis. One helped create. You created the famine? I created the conditions. By advocating for the 4-field rotation before the soil was ready. The first winter crop failed. 23 villages went short. He said it flatly. Without self-pity, without drama. The voice of a man confessing a mistake he had carried for 6 centuries because no one had ever asked him about it. The handwriting gets looser again in 1407, Nell said quietly. The second attempt worked. The soil adapted. And the 23 villages, I fed them, personally. From my own stores. A pause. It was the only time in my life I wished I could eat bread, so I could understand what they were missing. They looked at each other. His face was absolutely composed. Hers was trying very hard to be. One dinner, she said, to discuss the journal, and whatever this right situation actually is. 1. My car will. I'll take a leaf, text me the address. His expression shifted to something she hadn't seen before. Complete bewilderment. I do not text. You've never sent a text message? I have existed for 8 centuries. For 770 of those, the pinnacle of written communication was a sealed letter delivered by a man on a horse. I have not yet found reason to downgrade. Well, you have now, figure it out. She turned back to the journal. After a moment, she heard him leave. Or rather, she noticed the absence of cold air and the particular weight of his stillness. When she looked up, the space where he'd been standing was empty. Her phone buzzed 40 minutes later. The message read, This A.Z.D. Dean Sterling. I have acquired a telephone device. The address of my residence is as follows. Please confirm receipt of this communication at your earliest convenience. G. Sterling, King of the Northern Court. Followed, 12 seconds later, by, the telephone has corrected my spelling without permission. I find this deeply presumptuous. Nell pressed her lips together very hard and did not laugh. Chapter 3. The Castle. The castle looked like someone had taken a mountain, given it ambitions, and added turrets. Dave, her lift driver, a cheerful man who had grown progressively more silent as they drove up the torchlit road, pulled to a stop at the base of a drawbridge. You sure about this, lady? He asked. My GPS just switched to a language I don't think exists anymore. I'm sure, Dave, you can just drop me here at the drawbridge. At the drawbridge. Dave looked at the gargoyle perched above the portcullis. The gargoyle, Nell was almost certain, looked back. 5 stars, Dave said weakly, and drove away. Phineas was waiting inside. He was holding a modern tablet, the technological kind this time, which looked deeply incongruous against his waistcoat. Ms. Savanaugh, he said with a slight bow. His Majesty is preparing for your arrival. He has been preparing for approximately 9 hours. He asked me to convey that he has, and I am quoting, resolved the texting situation. Has he? He sent 14 messages to my telephone in the past hour. Each was formatted as a formal memorandum. One contained a subject line. He led her through corridors that spanned entire centuries of interior design. Gothic stone gave way to Baroque gilt, which opened into a room that looked unmistakably like a 1970s ski lodge. Wood paneling, orange shag carpet, a fondue set on a sideboard. His Majesty redecorates a wing every century or so, Phineas explained, noticing her expression. He then forgets about it. This wing was completed in 1974. He was, I believe, going through a phase. He had recently discovered the concept of après-ski. He committed to it fully. The dining room was enormous. A fireplace the size of a small car roared at one end. The table was set for two, one at each end, separated by approximately 30 feet of polished wood. Gideon stood by the fireplace, dressed in formal black. He was staring at a smartphone the way a man might stare at a wasp that had landed on his hand, with intense concentration and the strong desire to be somewhere else. "Welcome," he said, pocketing the phone with a guilty start. "Thank you," Nell said, looking at the table. "Are we dining together or establishing diplomatic relations between distant nations?" "Protocol dictates the seating arrangement. Protocol puts me in a different time zone." He hesitated. Then he made a small gesture to a servant, who moved one place, setting from the far end to a position 4 feet from his own. "It was the kind of concession that clearly cost him something better," she said, sitting. The food arrived in waves. Each course was more historically baffling than the last. A pottage, a whole fish with its head, a slab of meat, Gideon referred to as boar's flank, he did not eat. A plate was set before him for each course, and he regarded it with the expression of someone receiving bad news they'd already expected. "You can't eat any of this," Nell said. It was not a question. "My biology rejects mortal food. So you just watch it as my duty as host." He paused. The menu was selected from my personal records. These were the finest dishes served in the courts of Europe between 1280 and 1450. The fish has its head on. That was considered elegant. The fish is looking at me. It is a presentation choice. It is judging me, Gideon. He looked at the fish, then at her. "You may be anthropomorphizing the trout." "I'm definitely anthropomorphizing the trout. It's the only friend I have at this table who's also out of their depth." Something happened to his mouth, not a smile. He seemed constitutionally opposed to those, but adjacent. A loosening. "Does it bother you?" she asked. The not eating, watching everyone else. "Does what bother me? Every meal. Every dinner party for 8 centuries. Watching other people eat and knowing you can't." He was quiet for a moment. The performed silence of a king, considering his words, gave way to the quieter kind. The silence of someone who hadn't been asked. "It is not the food," he said. "I do not miss the mechanism. What do you miss? The table. The sitting together, the act of sharing something unremarkable with another person. I can sit at a table. I cannot share the meal. The distinction has a weight. That's a very particular kind of lonely." He looked at her. It was a different look than before, less composed, more exposed, as if she'd said something he hadn't been expecting. "Yes," he said, "it is." They were quiet for a moment. Then Nell said, "The boar's flank is terrible, by the way." It was considered a delicacy in 1340. 1340 had low standards. 1340 had the plague. Standards were, by necessity, adjusted. She laughed. The same sharp, too loud laugh she'd been trying to soften her whole life. His hand, which had been resting on the table, went very still. "You do that," she said. "Do what? Go still when I laugh. Like something's happened that you need to process." He looked at his hand. "I have not heard someone laugh like that in this room in a very long time." "How long?" "Long enough that I had forgotten what it sounds like when someone is not performing." The air between them shifted. Nell became aware that his hand was 4 inches from hers on the table. His skin was pale, cold-looking. Hers was warm. The contrast was visible. She didn't move her hand, neither did he. "Tell me about the rite," she said, "the real version, not the diplomatic summary." He drew a breath. Unnecessary, performative. The habit of a creature who'd spent 8 centuries pretending to be human. The rite of resonance is old, older than any court. It was designed to lock a vampire's senses onto a specific individual through a first feeding during a celestial alignment. The result is a unidirectional compulsion. The vampire is drawn to the individual, perpetually. And it was supposed to be Lady Octavia. Lady Octavia has been the intended recipient for 40 years. She has prepared. The court has prepared. The celestial alignment occurs once per century. He looked at her. And I chose the wrong mask. You didn't choose anything. You assumed. I assumed. Yes, he was quiet. The assumption cost Lady Octavia her century. It cost you your consent. Both are. Both are things I cannot undo. His voice had changed. The theatrical register, the regal composure. They were gone. What was left was quieter. Simpler, the voice of a man who had made a mistake that his centuries of experience should have prevented. I'm sorry, he said, not as the king. As the person who did it. Nell looked at him. His jaw was tight. A muscle worked at his temple. Not a blush, not a flush, but the old involuntary tension of a body that hadn't had a pulse in 800 years. Okay, she said. Okay, as in, I hear you. Not okay, as in, we're fine, we're not fine, but I hear you. He nodded once. The relief on his face was barely visible, but it was there. Then the doors burst open. A woman swept into the room like a weather system. She was tall, dark-haired, and wearing a look of such refined, aristocratic fury that it could have stripped paint. Behind her trailed 3 attendants, each carrying scrolls. Lady Octavia, Phineas announced from the doorway, in the tone of a man who had tried to prevent this and failed. Lady Octavia's gaze swept from Gideon to Nell to the place setting that had been moved 4 feet closer and back to Gideon. I see, she said. You've seated her at the familiar distance. Lady Octavia, 40 years. Her voice was controlled and sharp as a blade. 40 years of preparation. Do you know what 40 years means to someone who takes ceremonies seriously? It means fittings. It means rehearsals. It means an entire wardrobe commissioned for a single evening. And you gave my right to a woman in a mask from a, what was it called? Spooky's Party Barn. Phineas supplied helpfully. Spooky's Party Barn. She said each word as if it caused her physical pain. Then she turned to Nell. You. What are you? A graduate student, Nell said. I study crop rotation. Crop rotation, 14th century. Wallachian. Lady Octavia stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to Gideon. The poem is now at Canto 9, she said. I wanted you to know. Your meter is excellent, Phineas offered. I know, said Lady Octavia, and swept from the room. End of chapter 4. The Mark. In the silence that followed, Nell set down her fork. Who is she really? She asked. Gideon was standing. He'd risen when Octavia entered, and hadn't sat back down. His composure had reassembled itself, but it was thinner than before, like a coat that no longer quite fit. Lady Octavia has been a member of my court for 3 centuries. She is formidable, principled, and, in this matter, entirely justified in her fury. You didn't answer my question. Who was she supposed to be after the rite? He looked at her. The rite designates a consort. Under the laws of my court, the recipient of the rite is... Wait, Nell held up a hand. Consort. You're telling me the ceremony that you performed on me, by accident, was a consort selection? In a legal sense? In a legal sense. In a legal bet and sense. She stood up. You bit me at a party, and now I'm your what? Your vampire wife? The term is resonance consort, and the legal framework is considerably more nuanced than you bothering to mention it at any point in any of our conversations. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Heavier, less performative. I was attempting to find a resolution before the legal implications became relevant, he said. The legal implications became relevant, the MOM, and you bit me. You knew this. You knew it when you showed up at my door. You knew it when you brought me the journal. You knew it when you moved my place setting. He said nothing. His face was very still. What else? She said. What else haven't you told me? Phineas, who had remained in the doorway throughout, cleared his throat. Mrs. Kavanagh, if I may. No, Gideon said. She deserves the full account, not from you. From me. He turned to face her. The theatrical register was completely gone now. What remained was stripped back, plain and careful. The right of resonance is old, he said. Older than any court. In its earliest form, it was not a ceremony, it was a tool. A hunting technique. The first vampires used it to lock their senses onto prey they could not catch by other means. The ceremonial framing, the consort language, the celestial alignment, the formality. Those were additions. Layers placed over something more fundamental. A tracking mechanism, Nell said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. And when you showed up at my door with your biological imperative and your directional compulsion, you were describing a hunting instinct. I was describing the physiological reality. The context. The context is that your ancestors designed a system to mark their prey, and you used it on me. And then you told me it was a ceremony. I did not use it deliberately. You didn't tell me what it was. You stood in my hallway and said, I don't know why I'm here, when you knew exact why. Why you were here. You knew the history. You knew the legal implications. You chose not to tell me either. He opened his mouth, closed it. The muscle at his jaw worked once and then went still. You are right, he said. I know I'm right. I'm a researcher. Being right is the only part of this I'm qualified for. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She didn't snatch it. She didn't throw anything. She put her coat on with the calm, deliberate movements of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in being talked out of it. The journal, she said. Do you want it back? No, good. Because I'm keeping it. It's the only honest thing you've given me. She walked past him toward the door. As she passed, her arm brushed his, warm against cold, accidental, electric. Neither of them acknowledged it. At the doorway she paused. Don't come to the hallway tonight, she said, or any night. I know you can hear me from the coffee shop. Stay there, she left. Phineas waited precisely 40 seconds before speaking. Assessment? Gideon asked. He was standing where she'd left him, his hand on the back of the chair she'd been sitting in. She identified the core deception accurately and within 30 seconds of learning the relevant facts. She distinguished between the accidental nature of the right and the deliberate nature of the omission. She took the journal, a primary source document, rather than a sentimental token. Her exit was controlled, not emotional. Your assessment, Phineas, not a case file. Phineas set down his tablet. You hid a relevant truth from an intelligent person because you believed knowing it would hurt her. She is angry not because the truth is unpleasant, but because you decided for her what she could handle. It is, he added, a pattern I have observed in your conduct over several centuries. Thank you. You are welcome, sire. That was not gratitude, I am aware. Gideon looked at the table. 2 place settings. 1 barely touched, 1 untouched entirely, 4 feet apart instead of 30. A concession that now felt like an accusation. I need to fix this, he said. I would suggest beginning with what she actually asked for, Phineas said. She asked you not to come to the hallway. She did not ask you to disappear. There is a distinction. She told me to stay at the coffee shop. She told you she knows you're there. Knowing is not the same as objecting. The sun rises in 4 hours. I cannot stay past dawn. Then I suggest you make productive use of the remaining dark. The coffee shop on Elm Street opens at 5. The barista does not ask questions. Gideon stared at him. Is that your professional interpretation? That is my 500-year interpretation of human communication. It is, I believe, more reliable than your 800 years of ignoring it. Gideon turned to the window. Outside, the mountain was dark against a darker sky. Somewhere out there, he could feel the precise direction, the pull, a steady pressure behind his ribs. A graduate student was getting into a taxi and going home to an apartment he could not enter. The resonance consort claim, he said. Under court law, it carries standing. It does, even if the recipient was even if the right was performed on the wrong individual, yes. The law does not account for error. It is, I should note, a law you wrote. I wrote it 300 years ago. You wrote it. You could unwrite it. Renouncing a resonance consort claim has not been done in the history of the Northern Court. Many things have not been done until they were done, sire. Gideon was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The untouched plate sat on the table. The chair she'd been sitting in was still warm. He could feel it from 4 feet away. The fading heat of a body that ran 37 degrees and had a pulse and laughed too loudly and did not suffer fools. Convene the court tomorrow, he said. I will renounce the claim. Phineas made a note. The political cost will be considerable. I know. Lady Octavia will request a formal remedy. She deserves one, and Ms. After the renunciation. That, Gideon said, is her decision. Not mine. I have made enough of her decisions for her. Phineas looked at him, a long, assessing look that carried 5 centuries of service and something that might, in a less clinical person, have been called affection. I will convene the court, he said, and I will brew the coffee. For the shop, I can. You cannot operate the machine, sire. We have discussed this. End of chapter 5. The text. 3 days passed. Nell spent them in the library. She worked on her dissertation. She ate vending machine dinners, 2 bags of pretzels and a granola bar, the food of people who have given up on feeding themselves properly and are deeply at peace with it. She also did something else. On the second day, she pulled every text on the right of resonance she could find through the university's interlibrary loan system. There wasn't much, 3 references. In medieval Slavic folklore compilations, 2 oblique mentions in a 1920s anthropological survey, and a passage in a 17th century herbal treatise that was almost certainly about something else entirely. But Nell Kavanagh was a doctoral researcher, and doctoral researchers do not stop at 5 sources. She cross-referenced, she traced citations. She found, buried in a footnote of a Romanian agricultural record from 1403, a passage that made her stop reading and sit very still for a long time. On the 3rd day, a package arrived at her apartment. No return address. Inside, the journal she'd already taken, this was a second one, 1412 to 1420, bound in darker leather. A single sheet of heavy paper with 1 line written in precise antique handwriting. I am sorry. G, and a phone. Not a new phone. Hess' phone. The one he'd been staring at in the castle, like it owed him money. She turned it on. There was 1 text message in the drafts folder. It had been composed, deleted, recomposed, and saved 14 times. She could see the edit history. The final version read, Dear Ms. Kavanagh, I have, as of this morning, formally renounced all claims arising from the right of resonance before the assembled court. The legal implications I failed to disclose are now void. You are not bound, claimed, or obligated in any capacity. Lady Octavia has been offered a formal remedy, the details of which I expect she will incorporate into her poem. I am informed that this message should be shorter. I am also informed that the correct closing for a text message is not yours in perpetuity. I do not know what the correct closing is. I am closing it anyway, Gideon. Below that, clearly added later, in a separate message, I miss the sound of your laugh. That is not a ceremonial observation. That is just true. Nell read it twice. She set the phone down. She picked it up. She read it a 3rd time. Then she put on her coat and called a lift. Dave, the same Dave, by either coincidence or cosmic joke, pulled up at the drawbridge. You again? He said. My GPS is already screaming. One more time, Dave. You know I've started learning Latin for these drives. Feels like it might be useful. Phineas was not at the door this time. Nell walked through the entrance hall, past the Baroque wing, past the 1970s ski lodge, through the medieval corridor with the battle tapestry, and followed the sound of something she did not expect to hear from a castle at 3 in the morning. A kettle whistling. She found Gideon in the kitchen. It was an enormous room. Stone walls, copper pots that hadn't been used since the invention of the microwave, and a single modern kettle sitting on a counter like a visitor from another dimension. Gideon was standing in front of it, holding a mug in one hand and a box of chamomile tea in the other, and wearing the expression of a man attempting to defuse a bomb with a recipe written in a language he did not speak. "You're making tea," she said from the doorway. He turned, for a moment, half a second, no more. His face was completely unguarded, something bright and desperate and immediately controlled. "I am attempting to make tea," he said. "I cannot taste it to determine if it is correct. I have been consulting the box. The box says to steep for 3 to 5 minutes. This is an unacceptable range. 3 and 5 are very different numbers. It's fine at 4. I have been steeping it for 7. That's too long, I see?" He looked at the mug with an expression of personal failure. "I will begin again, Gideon." She stepped into the kitchen. The stone floor was cold under her shoes. He was cold too. She could feel the temperature change from 4 feet away, the way the air around him ran cooler. "I got the package." "Yes, and the phone." "Yes." He set the mug down. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She had never seen his hands be not entirely steady. The text was, "I was informed." It was too long. I was also informed that the phrase, "yours in perpetuity," is not standard. It was perfect, she said. He looked at her, not the composed, controlled look. Not the theatrical horror. Something rawer than both. The expression of someone who has given away his only card and is waiting to find out if it was enough. "I did some research," she said, "after I left." "Research? I'm a researcher. It's what I do." She took a breath. "The right of resonance." The oldest sources describe a unidirectional physiological compulsion. Proximity seeking, attention anchoring, sensory fixation. You told me that. What you didn't tell me, what I found in a footnote of a Romanian agricultural record from 1403, of all places, is that the right's effects are exclusively mechanistic. Mechanistic. The right creates a pull. A directional pull. The vampire is drawn toward the individual. The mechanism is physiological. Proximity reduces the intensity. Everything else, the interest, the journal, the apology, the 14 drafts of a text message, the 7 minutes of chamomile steeping, that's not the right, that's you. He was very still. The kind of still that meant something was happening inside, that his body couldn't express because it hadn't had a heartbeat in 8 centuries. "I found it in a footnote," she said, "of all places." A footnote, 17. Page 342. Cross-referenced with 2 Slavic folklore indices and 1 very questionable herbal treatise. She was smiling now, small, specific, the smile of someone presenting a well-sourced argument. "The right didn't make you care about me. It just kept you close enough to find out that you did." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was not performed. It was the silence of 2 people standing in a castle kitchen at 3 in the morning with a ruined cup of chamomile tea between them, and the entire enormous weight of 8 centuries and a $4 mask finally resolving into something simple. Footnote 17. He said, "I can show you the citation. I believe you." He took 1 step toward her. The cold moved with him, the particular chill of a body that ran 15 degrees below human. The signature temperature of something old and inhuman and at this moment, more vulnerable than it had been in centuries. "Nella." "Yes?" I would like to kiss you. I am asking. I know you are, is the answer. She closed the distance. She put her warm hands on either side of his cold face and kissed him in the kitchen. Next to the oversteeped tea and the copper pots and the kettle that was still faintly whistling. His mouth was cool. His hands, when they settled at her waist, were careful. The deliberate restraint of something powerful, choosing to be gentle. She could feel the stillness in him, the centuries of composure bending around this single point of contact like water around a stone. When they pulled apart, his eyes had shifted. Darker at the edges, something amber moving in the depths. Your hands are warm, he said. Your hands are freezing. Always, I know, she held them. Anyway. Later, much later, they sat on the kitchen floor, because the kitchen had no chairs and neither of them wanted to move to a room that had them. Nell leaned against the stone wall. Gideon sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off him like a winter window. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. When was the last time someone surprised you? Really surprised you, he thought about it. Not for show, genuinely considered, the way someone considers a question they haven't been asked before. 1623, he said. A woman I knew, a human, a bookseller, asked me if I was happy. No one had ever asked me. I was so startled, I answered. Honestly, what did you say? I said I didn't know. That I had lived so long, I was no longer sure what happiness felt like versus what habit felt like. What happened to her? She grew old. He said it simply, without self-pity, the way you'd say the sun came up. I have thought about her question every decade since. I have never had a better answer. Until now. He turned to look at her. His expression was quiet, honest, stripped of every ceremonial layer. Until now, he said. I had not been asked again. She didn't say anything. She just rested her head against the cold stone wall and let his cold shoulder press against her warm one, and sat with the enormousness of what he'd just given her. Not a kingdom, not a journal, not a text message composed 14 times, but one honest sentence from a man who had 800 years of sentences saved up and had never found anyone he trusted enough to spend them on. Now, yes. There is something I should tell you about the pull. She lifted her head. What about it? It has been less since you arrived tonight. But it is still there. It will always be there. You should know that, if this continues. The pull does not end. I know, I read the footnote. And that does not. She reached for his hand. Cold fingers, long, a signet ring on the fourth finger. She laced her warm fingers through his cold ones. You're a homing pigeon, she said, and I'm a crop rotation specialist. Nothing about this is normal, but I didn't come back because of the right, and you didn't stay in a coffee shop for 3 nights because of the right, and that terrible, terrible text message was definitely not because of the right. The text message was not terrible. It had a subject line, Gideon. Subject lines provide context and organizational clarity in a text message. I stand by my formatting choices. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, carefully, precisely, as if calibrating the exact amount of pressure a human hand could tolerate. I would like, she said, to offer you something. He looked at her. My wrist, she said, if you want it. The kitchen went very still. Not quiet, still. The difference was Gideon, who had stopped breathing, stopped blinking, stopped doing every small performative thing that made him look human. You understand what that means, he said. His voice had dropped, not threateningly, reverently. I understand what it means. It is intimate, I know, and I, at the Masquerade, I took without asking. I do not want. This is not the Masquerade. This is me. Choosing for myself. She held out her wrist. He looked at it, at the thin skin, the blue veins, the warmth radiating off her like a small sun. And his eyes went fully amber, a color she'd never seen in any human, the predators surfacing for one clear-held moment. He took her wrist in both hands. His grip was light, precise. He pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, cold mouth against warm pulse, and she felt the small, sharp sting, and then nothing but closeness. Not loss, not fear. Just the specific, extraordinary intimacy of being fully known by someone who had spent 8 centuries knowing no one. He drew back after a moment, a single drop at his lip. His eyes were closed. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard. She pulled her wrist back and pressed her thumb against the small wound. "How was it?" He opened his eyes. The amber was fading, the dark returning. He looked for the first time since she'd met him, like someone who had run out of words in every language he knew. "Like a footnote," he said finally. "That changes the meaning of the entire text." 2 weeks later, in the kitchen, that had become their kitchen, despite the castle having 47 other rooms, Nell sat at a small table she'd made Gideon purchase from an ordinary furniture store. It was assembled by a man named Lars, using an Allen wrench, and it is the most dignified piece of furniture I have ever owned, Gideon had said. Not meaning a word of it, she was working on her dissertation. He was reading her latest chapter, red pen in hand, because he apparently believed he was qualified to fact-check a doctoral thesis about a period of history he had personally lived through. "You have the planting season wrong in paragraph 4, he said. "I have the planting season documented in 3 peer-reviewed sources. Your 3 peer-reviewed sources were not standing in the field in November of 1387. Eyewitness testimony is the least reliable form of evidence. I am not an eyewitness. I am the primary source. Your bibliography should cite me. I am not citing Gideon Sterling personal communication, circa 1387, in a doctoral thesis. Why not? Because my committee would ask follow-up questions I cannot answer without revealing that my boyfriend is an 800-year-old vampire king. The term boyfriend is reductive. What would you prefer?" He considered this with the gravity of a man drafting a treaty. "Resonance partner. That sounds like a yoga class. Then consort. That sounds like a period drama. I was in the period, the drama was." "The drama," she said, leaning over to kiss the top of his head. "The cold, still ancient top of his head, is you. It has always been you." He caught her hand, cold fingers around warm ones. A temperature contrast visible to anyone who cared to look, and no one was looking because it was 3 in the morning, and they were alone in a castle kitchen, with an IKEA table and a dissertation about crop rotation, and a pull that would never end, and a love that had nothing to do with it. "Nell?" "Yes. Paragraph 4 is still wrong." She picked up her red pen and drew a large X through his correction. "Cited and rejected," she said. "Insufficient peer review." And he laughed. The short, sharp, incredulous bark of sound that she had heard once before, at a dinner that felt like a lifetime ago, the sound of 8 centuries of composure cracking open to let something warm and human and utterly undignified slip through. He laughed, and she laughed, and the castle was quiet around them, and it was enough.